Last week, when I was preparing this homily, I was scouring the almighty and truthful, all-knowing, and never deceptive internet. That's satire in case you didn't get that. But I did find this little quip about parents. You might be able to relate to it, especially if you have small children. Whenever your children are out of control, you can take comfort from the thoughts that even God's omnipotence did not extend to his own children. After creating heaven and earth, God created Adam and Eve. And one of the first things God said was, don't. Don't what? Adam replied. Don't eat the forbidden fruit, God said. Forbidden fruit? We have forbidden fruit? Hey, Eve, we have forbidden fruit. No way, says Eve. Yes way, says Adam. Do not eat the fruit, says God. Then Adam and Eve asked in unison, why? God replies, because I'm your father and I said so. And then he begins wondering why he hadn't stopped creation after making the elephants. A few minutes later, God saw his children having an apple break. Didn't I tell you not to eat their fruit? Adam replied, Then why did you, said the father. And he even spoke up and said, well, the serpent made me do it. Then Adam said, she started it. Did not, did to, did not. And so the argument continued. But having had the two of them, God's punishment was that Adam and Eve should have children of their own. The pattern was set, and it hasn't changed since then. Now, I know that none of us here today would ever have siblings or families that did anything like that. But I've heard of families where such squabbles do occur. But there's also another squabble that occurs and seems to be very prevalent and universal in families. In case you might be unfamiliar with it, it's called the "it's not fair" argument. The author Anne Crittenden wrote a book for women considering business careers, and she titled her work, "If You Raised Kids, You Could Manage Anything." In her book, she says that children are hardwired for fairness. She says this is probably due to the bad old days when parental partiality could be fatal to less favored child. As an example, she tells of her visit to the Galapagos Islands, where she observed the parenting practices of a bird called the blue-footed booby. Yes, I did go look it up. It is a bird called the blue-footed booby. It actually has blue feet. She says the blue-footed booby hatches two eggs. Then she watches these two eggs closely and observes which of the newborn chicks is the sturdiest and most likely to survive. Then she boots the other chick out of the nest to die. It appears that was just a sparrow. She also writes, small children view any trace of parental favoritism with the same panic that must be felt by the luckless booby chick. Every parent has probably heard the English cry, her piece is bigger than mine. I want one just like Johnny's. You love him better than me, don't you? Unfairness can feel like a matter of life and death at one time, says Anne Crittenden, and it probably was. My own parents solved that kind of problem within our own family in a small way. After dinner sometimes we would have ice cream, and there were 5 of us, and they got tired of hearing that's not fair. So what they decided to do is they would choose one of us to scoop ice cream into the 5 bowls. Then the other 4 got to pick which bowl they wanted first. The scooper got the last bowl. You can be sure there was a lot of fairness in the scooping of ice cream in the bowls. Fairness is the oldest contention in society. All we have to do is remember how it began. Adam and Eve's 2 boys, Cain and Abel. They brought their offerings to God. And for some reason, God accepted Abel's offering, but not Cain's offering. And Cain thought in his heart, and his resulting anger was the source of humanity's first murder. But we hear it not only just among children, we hear it amongst adults as well. That's one of the reasons why we have lawyers and judges, and if things get out of hand, we also have police. It's also the reason why some families are split after an example of a reading of a will. It's why some people always feel victimized in their society, because life is not fair. I'll even bet that there's a lack of fairness sometimes in the workplace. Some people actually get paid less than others, even though they do more work than others. And it seems that some people actually get paid to do nothing. life is not fair. Everyday society will always hear that phrase, that life is not fair. But fairness is just as big for adults as it is for children. As a sports official, I have been for 51 years now, a referee and an umpire. Believe me when I tell you that I know all about fairness. I'm a qualified expert in fairness. And besides, I learned fairness when I was young. I have brothers and sisters. So Jesus told a parable about a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. This was a common practice in that part of the world, particularly during a grape harvest, because storms could very easily ruin the crop, and it was important to get the harvest in as quickly as possible. So for a time, anyone who wanted a job could have one. The work was hard, and hours usually from dawn to sunset. The wage was a standard one, a denarius, or you might call it a silver coin. The denarius was not only the average daily wage for a worker, but it was also the cost of surviving the day for the poor masses of families in Israel. It didn't allow any room for maneuver. A denarius should buy your family exactly what they needed to stay alive, no more, no less. So a day's work and a full day's wage was essential to survival. Now that's living from paycheck to paycheck on a daily basis. During the grape harvest, men who wanted to work would go to the marketplace and stand around. It was like just going over to the 7-Eleven here early in the morning on Ocotillo and seeing the men there looking for a job every day. They would work the 12 hours and then they would be paid at the end of the day, so each man would go home with money to buy food for his family. And if a man was unable to find work on a particular day, then his family would not eat. If he found work only part of the day, thus was unable to earn a whole denarius, his family would eat, but they would still be feeling hunger pangs. When I first moved to Arizona, I was in that situation. I had to work every day, 7 days a week, to be able to eat and pay rent and buy gas and all the things that go along with living. And I was okay with that. If you have ever lived in that kind of situation, you probably have a little deeper appreciation for the workers in this parable and what is actually at stake. It is not only about fairness for some, it's also about survival. The landowner went out in the morning to hire workers. He agreed to pay these workers a standard wage of a denarius for the day. About 9 in the morning, he went back to the marketplace and saw their men standing around doing nothing. Obviously, no jobs were available. And he tells them, "You too go out and work in my vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. He went out about noon, and around 3 in the afternoon did the same thing. About 5 in the afternoon, the final hour of the workday, he went out and found others still standing around. He told them to go work in the vineyard too. When quitting time came, the owner of the vineyard said to his foreman, "Call the workers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last one's hire, and then going to the first." Imagine those workers who were hired and worked just 1 hour, and they received a denarius. Can you imagine how deliriously happy they were to receive a full day's wage for that 1 hour's work? They would be able to feed their family. They would be able to pay their bills. How in the world, under such circumstances, could you expect them to even think about hiding their joy about what just happened? But that created a problem. When those who were hired first came to be paid, they knew the generous landowner had just paid the ones who only worked an hour. They were expecting a huge bonus. Can you imagine their disappointment when they received a single denarius? They did begin to grumble. Those who were hired last only worked an hour, they said. "You have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day." But the landowner addressed them very directly. "I am not being unfair to you, my friend. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take your pay and go. If I want to give to the one who was hired last the same as I gave you, don't I have the right to do what I want to do with my money? Or are you envious because I'm generous?" And then he added those words that we hear at the end of the gospel: "The last will be first, and the first will be last." This parable we could probably label as the generosity of God, because God pours out his grace full and completely on anyone who will receive it. We who have labored in the vineyard as Christians for most of our lives, we'd like to think that we'll get an extra measure of grace in return for our many years of service to our Lord and Savior. But it won't happen. It can't happen. The Father's love is without limits. He pours his grace out without reservation, without regard to who deserves it and who doesn't deserve it. I tell you, if it bothers you, get over it. Get over yourselves if you're worried about the amount of grace you receive or don't receive. If there are no limits on grace, if it exceeds everything for which we could ever hope, everything for which we could expect, how can one person say they receive more grace than another person? Grace from God. It is poured out in infinite quantities on us. It is totally unearned, whether we've labored for Christ for 50 years or just 50 minutes. All we have to do to receive God's grace is to have our hearts open to it. And to some people, that is not fair, but it is a fact. No wonder it's called Amazing Grace, especially by the person that wrote that song, Amazing Grace. Sometimes we don't deserve it at all. Sometimes Hollywood comes up with good movies that reflect the values we cherish, like the sanctity of human life. Many of us here have seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, which came out back in 1998. It's about the invasion of Normandy during World War II. The movie opens with an elderly man walking through a cemetery perched above the Normandy beach where the Allied troops landed on D-Day. He approaches a grave at the cemetery and he kneels down in front of it and he's weeping. And suddenly the movie jumps back to 54 years earlier to the day of the invasion. For the next 20 minutes, we see some of the most horrifying war sequences ever filmed. Some 5,000 Allied troops were either killed or wounded on the beaches of Normandy that day. And it seems like the movie shows every one of them. Finally, the beachhead was established, and from the moment the troops are safe. But then the real plot of the movie begins. 8 soldiers who survived the invasion are sent to rescue an American paratrooper named Patrick Ryan, who was dropped behind enemy lines. His other brothers, he had 4 of them, were killed in different places in the world during that World War II. And he wound up being the last son. And those soldiers were given the task to bring him home to his mother safe and sound, the last son. And they go through some harrowing experiences to find him. And they find him, and several of the men lose their lives trying to rescue him and get him out. The last one that's killed is the captain of the unit. He's played by Tom Hanks. And he's laying there dying. He says to Private Ryan, "Earn this." It's at that moment that the movie switches back to the gray-haired man at the cemetery kneeling down. And we are the ones that realize that looking at Private Ryan now in his 70s is kneeling before that grave of the captain. And when he says next, he asks his wife a question. "Tell me I've been a good person." She's very much puzzled. She doesn't understand it, but those who have watched the movie understand why he was asking that to her. He asks her, "Tell me that my life has been worth saving. Tell me that I have fulfilled the purpose for which the captain gave his life." I hope that's how many of us feel about our lives, because we know that grace is free. We know that we did nothing to deserve it, but we also know that it cost Christ his life on the cross. Do we hunger in our hearts? Do we think that our lives and how we have lived in response to the act of Jesus on the cross? Are we giving that self-giving love? Are we proving that we are worthy of that act? What kind of people would we be otherwise? Amazing grace. It's not fair. It's not just. It's just unbelievably generous. Something we all need. Not a single human being that has come into existence or will ever come into existence that cannot get to heaven without that sanctifying grace. And Jesus offers this to each one of us. We should strive to live every day of our lives with a deep sense of gratitude for the grace that comes into our lives through his act on the cross. We're about to receive the most holy Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. He is not a symbol. The Eucharist will never be a symbol, because a symbol will never give us the grace that we need to get to heaven. It comes from the person of Jesus Christ. The Eucharist is the real presence of Jesus in our daily lives. Once again, like he does every day at every Mass, he offers us the grace to do his will so that we might live in eternity with the most holy Trinity.